This week I'm building an island. Well, I wish it was this sort of island, but I'm making a kitchen island with a river tabletop and a mobile base cabinet with storage. So let's jump right in. For this build, I'm using some live edge cutoffs of a walnut slab that could have been doomed for the dumpster. I got these from Vintage Reclaimed Lumber here in Oklahoma City, where they save these cutoffs from the trash heap to be used in projects like these. These cutoffs were fairly flat, so I ran them through my planer to get them down to about 1.5 inches thick. I'm building the epoxy form out of some scrap 1/2-inch plywood I had laying around the shop, and then I cut them to fit the tabletop size I needed. I'll have all the dimensions and the cut list for this kitchen island linked down below in a build article. I covered the forms in sheathing tape and brought them inside because it's too cold to pour epoxy in my shop this time of year. I'm just using hot glue to hold the forms together, and I sealed the rest of the form with some silicone to prevent leaks. I also ran a bead of silicone along the edge of the slabs to prevent too much epoxy spillover, but as you'll see, I still ran into that problem. I used Total Boat's thick set epoxy for all the pours in this project, which I poured 1/2 inch deep at a time. This is a 3-to-1 epoxy, but the actual specs state it's 100 parts to 28 parts. I use a scale and I get really good results following this more precise ratio. I mixed in a black pigment and then this pearl white pigment. And this pearl white is going to allow me to swirl in a pattern into the epoxy. And as you'll see in the reveal, I got really good results. Okay, let's jump in and do some pouring. After the pours, I waited about 18 hours to do the second set of pours, and as you see, the epoxy is still kind of soft. The thick set epoxy takes about 2 days to fully harden. Now it's time to jump into making the base cabinet for this kitchen island, and when working with a full 5x5 sheet of 3/4 inch Baltic birch, I like to cut my panels oversized first and then cut them to their final width in the next step. The base cabinet is 17 inches deep, so I cut these 3 panels to about 17.5 inches wide. I got out my Rockler crosscut sled, which worked great for this application, but I was definitely maxing out the cutting capacity on this crosscut sled with these panels. Also, I clamped a spacer block to the fence so the panel doesn't bind up between the fence and the blade. I cut all of these panels for the base and the sides of the cabinet, and then these 3-inch wide strips, which will serve as the upper stretchers. Now I'll come back and cut the panels to their final width of 17 inches. A few of the panels are 16 3/4 inches deep to accept a 1/4 inch backer panel. And to ensure I get the exact spacing, I use this 1/4 inch Baltic birch scrap and clamped it to my fence. Plywood is always a tad undersized, and with this method, I don't have to measure to get a perfect fit. Now, jumping back to the tabletop, it's time for that third and final pour. For this big knot hole, I decided to try cold casting some brass. Okay, all the pours are done and it's back to the base cabinet and time for assembly. I'm using pocket screws and this Kreg K-4 pocket hole jig, and this is my go-to method for assembling any type of cabinets. On this project, I made sure to cut in all the pocket holes where they can't be seen on the finished cabinet, and I've got all the info on the proper pocket hole placement down in the build article. Also, Kreg is having a $15 rebate on their pocket hole jig, so now is definitely the time to go snag one of these. Before assembly, I pre-sanded all the panels up to 180 grit. I like to glue my panels and use these Rockler right angle clamps to keep everything square. Panels can shift as you drive in pocket screws, and this just helps to keep everything properly aligned. Onto the side of the cabinet that has the drawer and the two doors, and this panel is the lower section of that drawer compartment. I used it to set the exact spacing of the side panel, which I attached from underneath with screws. All of the pocket holes used to attach this panel will be hidden once that drawer is installed. Next, I drilled and countersunk holes to attach that center divider from the top and from underneath. Back to those 3-inch upper stretchers, and I cut them to size over on my miter saw and then drilled them some pocket holes. Also notice how I offset the pocket hole locations so those screws don't run into each other. A couple bar clamps here help pull the cabinet in tight while I attach those stretchers. Also, this backside stretcher is inset a 1/4 inch to accept that backer panel, and again I'm using that scrap piece to set my spacing. Okay, now we're almost to the home stretch, and I'm making the drawer out of 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood and a 1/4 inch drawer bottom. I keep my drawer assembly pretty basic by just using pocket hole screws and the corner clamps to keep it square. I also use the drawer itself to set the fence on my table saw when cutting the drawer bottom. Now, I'm not going to load this drawer up with anything heavy, so just screwing on the bottom panel is more than adequate. I'm using 14-inch full extension drawer slides, and I like to mount them to the center line of the drawer slides first. Next, I use this spacer block that I cut to screw the drawer slides into the inside of the cabinet. Last, I can install the drawer, and I get a perfect fit like 60% of the time, every time.
60% of the time, it works every time.
That doesn't make sense.
Moving on to the doors and the drawer front, I cut those to their final dimensions. I'm using some inset soft close Euro style hinges, spaced 12 inches apart and centered on the door and the cabinet. I made this storyboard with the proper spacing, and all I have to do is find center on my drawers and then transfer those hinge locations. I'm using shelf pins to mount the shelves so they can be height adjustable and removable to suit my needs. To install the drawer front, I'm using double-sided carpet tape and an 1/8-inch spacer. I clamp the drawer front in place and then secure it from the backside with a few screws. For the drawer pulls and the handle, I picked up a set from Home Depot, and these holes are spaced 3 inches apart, so I made this little jig to set my spacing. I'm I'm using 3-inch casters for this kitchen island, and first I have to attach these little spacer blocks so I can use long enough lag screws to secure the casters properly. I cut the 1/4-inch backer board and attached it with brad nails, and then I moved on to finish sanding the remaining panels in the doors up to 180 grit. I recently picked up this sander from Surf Prep, and I'm blown away with the results. It's got 3 different speed settings, and it's really the most comfortable sander I've ever used. I'll have a link for it down below. For the finish on the base cabinet, I'm just going to use wipe-on poly because it's super easy and quick. For the tabletop, I needed to use a belt sander to sand down the overflow of epoxy, but unfortunately, mine decided to die on me. Thankfully, the nice folks at VRL let me run it through their drum sander. A belt sander would have been more than adequate, but a lot of wood shops will do this sort of sanding for a fee if you need it. Back in my shop, and I cut the tabletop to its final size and used my Surf Prep sander to sand and polish the epoxy to a gloss. I used this little block plane that I got from Rockler to add a chamfer to all the edges. My favorite finish for a tabletop is Odie's oil. Now, it's not the cheapest finish, but for how long it lasts, it's probably the most cost-effective and the nicest finish I've used. It's also fairly easy to apply. You just rub it in with a Scotch-Brite pad and then buff it after an hour. With that done, I could attach the tabletop to the base cabinet with some figure-8 fasteners, and this kitchen island is done. I really love how this kitchen island turned out, and that walnut tabletop with the black swirled epoxy is absolutely gorgeous. This slimmer, mobile kitchen island works perfect for this narrow kitchen and helps provide extra storage and extra food prep area. I'd like to thank Rockler for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel, and all the Rockler products I use in this build are linked down below. Also, shout out to Total Boat and the thick set epoxy I used. I was able to get really good results in this piece. Thank you all for watching, and a very special thanks to my top Patreon supporters: Matt Varughese, David Britton, DFM Toolworks, Maker's Best Friend, and Lex the Historian, along with the rest of my Johnny Builds tribe. If you're interested in joining, I've got a link for that down below. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you back here next time.